So welcome to this evening's People, Place and Community seminar co-hosted with the London Group of Historical Geographers. This evening, Hannah Worthen from the University of Hull's Risky Cities project is going to talk to us about Watery Archives, researching the floods of the past alongside the communities of the present. Hannah is a historical geographer based at the University of Hull with specialisms in early modern history, gender and the environment. She is currently based in the Risky Cities project, where she researches people's relationships with their watery landscape in the past. And it is a huge personal pleasure for me to welcome Hannah here this evening. Hannah is a former colleague of mine and a research partner on a very different project about Methodist women, but I can assure you that we are in for a treat this evening. So over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth, so much. I'm just going to share my screen with you all. So just bear with me when I do that. Okay. So give me a shout or a thumbs up when that looks like it's working. Good. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak tonight, both from the Centre for People, Place and Community and from the London Group of Historical Geographers. It's a real honour to speak to you all tonight and to share about the project that I feel really passionately about. And I hope it's going to be really interesting tonight to hear about what we've been doing, and I really welcome the questions and the discussions that hopefully we'll have afterwards. It's important to say, as Ruth has said, that I'm here kind of on behalf of the team. The Risky Cities project had a real kind of at its core an ethos of collaborative working. So everything that we've done collaboratively. All of our papers have been co-authored, and we're a kind of interdisciplinary team of a mixture of senior academics, early career academics, and other kind of practitioners who've come into the project. So their names are there on the bottom of the screen. And you can see the link to our webpage, Twitters and things like that. So yes, so this is kind of me speaking to you on behalf of a really fantastic team with lots of different skills, without which we wouldn't have been able to do this project. But as Ruth said, I am a historian by background, a historical geographer, and so tonight's talk will really focus on the historical parts of the project primarily, and I will share with you lots of the research that we've done from a historical point of view, as well as some of the community work we've been doing. So I hope you're ready for travelling sort of backwards and forwards through time a fair amount. We'll go to the past and then to the present and think forward to the future as well. So just a really brief introduction to Risky Cities. This was a UKRI funded project. I say was, the funded period of the project has come to an end, although we are still actively doing kind of knowledge exchange and research work in Hull. And Risky Cities really had at its core a methodology that was to use humanities, creative and arts-based approaches to have conversations about climate and flooding with the people of Hull. Now, for those who aren't aware, Hull has a fairly recent, quite significant flood history. So 2007, like lots of other parts of the country, Hull experienced a major flood event. And then again in 2013 as well. And Hull is considered increasingly vulnerable to water hazards in the face of climate change. But we kind of recognise there's a real pressing need to have conversations with the people of Hull about their flood risk. So, for example, before the project started, only 6.6% of Hull's populations had signed up to receive the Environment Agency's flood alerts. And that's compared to 40% of the population in Doncaster, which is only about 40 minutes away. So there really was kind of a lack maybe of public conversation, public knowledge around Hull's flood risk. And this is a real issue because Hull is a city that is vulnerable to flooding, as I will talk about, and has a very significant flood history. Now, there's various reasons for that. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that at the end. I won't dwell on it. But yeah, there's this need, and still continues to be a need to talk about the communities, talk about flooding with the communities of Hull, but not just in a kind of knowledge sharing way, also in a way that captures the kind of views, experiences of the people of Hull as well. And therefore, the project developed what we called a learning histories approach. And this is where we took research from Hull, about Hull's histories, into the communities, and shared it with them and invited them to share their histories and knowledge with us. And along the way to produce some really amazing creative outputs, lots of which I will share with you tonight, in order to kind of have these collaborative and creative discussions around flood and climate change. So in the paper today, I really hope to give you some glimpses into the work that we've done. So it's going to be in two parts. The first part is really focused on Hull's kind of entangled relationship with water. So it's going to be situating Hull geographically, thinking about why it has this intermeshed relationship with water, and then how we use that in our conversations with communities in Hull today. And then the second part is going to move on to look more explicitly at flood histories. So I will share with you some of the research that we've conducted on an early modern flood event. As Ruth said, that's my specialism, early modern history. So I'll share with you some history about a flood event that happened in Hull in the 17th century, and then how we use some of these conversations and stories about historic flooding to talk to communities today about their kind of very real and present flood risk. So the sort of paper is split thematically, not chronologically. So yes, we'll kind of move backwards and forwards in time a fair amount. I hope that's okay. Ooh, skipped. So we'll start off with thinking about Hull's watery history. So firstly, for those who aren't familiar with Hull, wouldn't blame you. It's not really somewhere that you would necessarily pass kind of through to go anywhere else, but it is on the weather map. So that sometimes helps people situate it. So Kingston-Upon-Hull is situated at the kind of confluence of two watery bodies. So the River Hull, which is in black on this map, and the Humber estuary. And because of this position, it really kind of benefited in some ways from its watery location. So it has excellent trade connections to the North Sea and also inland to York. Now, this is a historic map of Hull from 1537, and you can see that as we kind of zoom in. Really here, they've got the Hull, which is going up, and then the Humber along the bottom. So Hull was a relatively small town, but that kind of remained a stable population up until about the early 16th century. And then as trade boomed, the city grew. And this position that it held on the banks of the Humber and of the Hull brought considerable benefits, and that's what helped the town kind of expand. But the area was also subject to repeated regular floods throughout its history. And that's partly because Hull was actually a town kind of created by flood, born of flood. There was a major flood event in the region in 1253, which washed away land at Myton and essentially kind of changed the course of the River Hull. And because of that, Hull as a city was able to be placed where it was. So the kind of impact that the flood had on the landscape and the way it changed the course of the river enabled the sort of landscape around where Hull is now to be suitable to be built into a city. So it has kind of floods at its origin story, but as a consequence of that, flood then becomes something that Hull is subject to repeatedly because of its low-lying, wet and marshy landscape. This is not always undesirable. So kind of annual flooding, regular flooding brought sediment to the grazing grounds and improved fertility. So just like how Hull's kind of position for trade and economic benefits, they're also agricultural too. However, storms, tidal surges, river floods did bring water into homes, warehouses, streets and fields. So because of that, Hull needed flood defences. Now, you might already, if you're looking at the map, be able to spot some of them on here. So we have at the bottom some wooden revetments. Now these protect the cannon, which is south of the old town, but would also have acted as flood defences. We have got some town walls built all the way around the town, but along the bottom here, would have also offered protection against the tidal waters of the Humber. And then finally, along the banks of the Hull, we have earthen banks, and there's going to be much more about banks in the course of this paper. Now, I've got another map. I did say on Twitter, this paper is filled to the brim with maps, so hope that is okay. I'm sure it is. I feel like this is an audience that appreciates a map. So this is another slightly later map, 1640 roughly. And you can, so this, everyone, if I can see your faces, you need to sort of turn on the side. Thank you, Ruth, because it's orientated the other way. So the Humber's running along the right and the Hull is kind of across. So you have to kind of imagine it tipped. So those banks that I showed you on the previous map are here on this map. And so, yes, you can see here very clearly the banks that would have provided some protection from the waters. And there will be more on those banks soon. So living, you can just see from these maps the kind of close relationship that Hull had with water. And you might imagine that really shaped the kind of day-to-day regular life of citizens in the town. So we're not just talking about flooding, kind of one-off catastrophic incidents, but just also the kind of the way in which the experience of living alongside water in this way shaped day-to-day life. So, for example, drinking water is a really good example of that. So Hull, being in a low-lying area, had a lot of saline intrusion into the groundwater. And as a consequence of that, to get fresh water, it had to be brought in from outside the town. And that came principally from townships lying to the west of the town. And therefore, infrastructure to carry that fresh water into the town was really important in order to maintain the health of the citizens. And you can see those watercourses on this really beautiful map. It's from later, it's 1906, but it does demonstrate where those watercourses would have gone. Lots of them would have been the same in the medieval period. So the watercourses that brought fresh water into the town had to be maintained. And this is often where we find glimpses of evidence about living with water when there's economic cost to it. So there were regular payments in the town's bench books for cleaning the ditches to make sure that the water stayed pure. And there are lots of orders for ensuring that the dikes are, for example, diked and dressed. And this is a quote from 1624, because stoppage of the dike being near grown up in many places. So there was a kind of knowledge and understanding that the water courses need to remain pure and unaffected by pollutants. Now, this is obviously not pollutant in a modern sense, but we do find that word in the early modern text. So the idea that the water needs to remain fresh and clean. And the kind of knowledge about water management was to a certain extent shared amongst the citizens. So I just need to, you're covering my screen. There we go. So here is an order from the bench books, which I can talk more about as a source later on. But this is one that is to do with the sewer system. So it's ordered that Mr. Robert Banks shall inquire and search which way and where the sewer along the walls of the town hath anciently run and been kept for cleansing the town. And James Robinson the elder, John Thurgle, and other old men and women as have anciently known the same. Now, I really enjoy this quote because I have a bit of a side hustle in women's history. So seeing the kind of reference to both old men and women is really interesting. But this quote just points to that sense that there is a kind of embedded knowledge around water, the historic way in which water was managed in the town, and that sort of form part of the knowledge of the citizens of Hull. We can also see evidence of the ways in which local people are involved in the active management of water. So, for example, this order that all the inhabitants do carry their soil to the walls and lay it there and not elsewhere, and that none do sweep their soil down the channel nor cast it into the streets. So this is essentially an order that the citizens of Hull keep the watercourses clean, And this would have been backed up by kind of a law. So therefore, there were penalties for citizens that didn't help to maintain the watercourses properly, and in particular for kind of polluting watercourses deliberately. So in this early modern period, you know, despite the knowledge around maybe bacteria and things not being in a modern sense, there definitely was knowledge and understanding that watercourses needed to be kept clean in order to keep citizens healthy, and that everybody who lived in the town had a kind of responsibility for that. So we can see that here. Now, this did change, this idea that the citizens were kind of collectively responsible for the cleanliness, for the health of the town via the watercourse, as we get the growth of private water companies. Seems to kind of replace this kind of public knowledge, public shared responsibility for water from about the 18th century onwards. I won't say too much more about that, but it's kind of interesting to reflect on as maybe private companies come in and take control of infrastructure around water, that kind of changes the way in which people relate to those infrastructures and feel responsibility for them. So now I've given you a little bit of a taste of the history, by no means all of it, but some. I want to talk about some of the ways we have used this historic, what we call kind of entangled relationship with water in some of our community engagement events. So I will give you another map, but this time, this is a map that was produced by one of our community members. And we did a workshop in the summer last year at the History Centre. Our participants are obsessed with the maps. They love them very much, and they go down a treat. So this is one of our participants took a couple of printouts of the maps that I've already shown you, and she kind of stuck them together. She did her own interpretation, where she put the sort of weaving of sort of widgets of watery pieces of paper. She put that on top of it. She took some of the craft supplies, and then she also added on kind of her watery places. So she's put on Humber Bridge in the top right corner. Obviously, that is not there in the early modern period, but it's an example of how somebody took the historic maps and kind of reinterpreted, reimagined it to make it more relevant for kind of her experience of water in the city. We also have this is a textile map. So we ran textile workshops in the city, and again used the maps and the histories that I've shared with you as a kind of jumping off point for those workshops. And this is a rather beautiful embroidery of it's the 16th century map, I think, yeah, that I showed you at the beginning. So she did this very beautiful embroidery version of that map. So we used facilitators for these workshops, and as kind of the weavings were happening, having discussions about water and history and climate and all these kinds of things. They were really wonderful workshops. And as a kind of result of those workshops, we ran an exhibition, well, it was a travelling exhibition actually, in autumn 2023, which layered together elements of Hull's history with participants' memories, stories, reflections, and, as you can see here, creative pieces. So also some rather lovely weavings there as well. So this was an exhibition called Follow the Thread, which toured the city in autumn 2023, visited by 938 people in total. And it was really wonderful that the people you can see in the picture here, they came to the workshops, so their kind of art was on display. I think that I'm not sure it's certain, but I think that might be what she's pointing at, you know, the thing that she made. So that was really lovely to share with our participants, you know, put it on the wall and for them to see it like that. So just to round off this first section, hopefully you've kind of demonstrated that water was a fundamental part of Hull's geography, but also the day-to-day life of the citizens. And we can tell from the archives, from the history, that managing this watery landscape was a really fundamental part of people's daily lives. And we use this history, and in particular some of the maps I've shared with you, as starting points for conversations. And I think our participants were really inspired by that history and really kind of ran with it and did something with it for themselves. So yeah, that's kind of by way of an introduction. Now I want to, the second part of the paper just really focus on flood histories, because as I explained in the beginning, that was a real motivation for our project, was to talk about flooding and talk about flood histories. So like I said at the start, Hull has kind of lived memory of fairly significant flood events. 2007, that's what the pictures on the screen are here. There was a serious flood event. Now this was caused by a combination of factors, unusually heavy rainfall, and kind of exacerbated by the inability of Hull's drainage system to manage that rainfall. As I explained at the beginning, the kind of features of Hull means that kind of lying in like a bit of a basin, and so it cannot drain its own water. It needs to be pumped out, and that was the case. That's been the case all the way through. So as a consequence of the drainage system in 2007 being overwhelmed, the kind of drains were essentially overwhelmed, and there was lots of damage. So over 7,000 houses were flooded. So there are lots of regions of Hull that have recent memories, lived experience of flooding. I was doing a workshop a few weeks ago, and a couple there were showing me the pictures of their kind of house renovation, because they lived in their house as all the work was going on, and they were put the doors down on the joists of the floor and were kind of hopping between them as the builders were doing their work. So yes, so that was 2007, which in Hull is the kind of byword for flood, if you say 2007, so yeah, flood. And there also was a storm surge in 2013, which breached the seawalls and flooded homes adjacent to the Humber. Oh, and what you can see in the top right of the screen, that is the flood barrier, the tidal barrier, that goes down when the Humber rises. It was built in the 60s, anticipated to only go down a couple of times a year, but it goes down, I think, a couple of times a month. So it's used a lot, and is not necessarily going to be kind of effective in the future. So this is another example of a more contemporary flood from the 1930s. So Hull, as well as the early modern flood event, which I will talk to you about in a minute, Hull has lots of other flood events. This is one from 1931, and the actual newspaper article has got this really lovely description. You'll see here, waitresses marooned on tables, shop hands work in bare feet. So it says in the newspaper article that when there were kind of cafes that were in the basements on Hull High Street, and when the water came down, the basements flooded, but they kept the cafes open. The waitresses took their shoes off, jumped between the tables, taking orders. Oh, and a final little detail on the picture here, this is horse and cart going under the bridge on Chance Ave. So I used this slide at a workshop again quite recently, and someone there said, oh, I've got a picture of that exact scene, so flood under that bridge, but it's from the 1960s. So there was lots of flooding in Hull in the 1960s, and it's a picture from the newspaper of his dad's car stuck under the bridge. So he's got a kind of clipping of in the 1960s, his dad's car stuck under the bridge, and his kind of 6-year-old handwriting, he's written my dad's car. So this was a particular issue under the bridge on Chance Ave, because they kind of dug the road down in order to allow the height, for the cars and the lorries under the railway bridge. It floods a lot there. So one of the things we've done as a project is to try and reconstruct a flood timeline of Hull. So there's this kind of recent memory of Hull, 2007 to 2013. There is some knowledge of the flood events in the 60s in particular that led to the flood barrier, but maybe not so much kind of going back beyond that. So one of the things we've tried to have done is reconstruct a flood timeline. Now, apologies in advance, this slide is very busy and super small, so not necessarily going to work very well, but it gives you a sense of the type of flood events that we have been reconstructing. So just a very brief word on methods. Up until this point, our research has primarily been archival, so looking at written sources of flood, a little bit of work on literary sources, but primarily historical archival searches. We haven't as yet done any kind of serious archaeological or sedimentary work, although we are hoping to do maybe some of that in the future to kind of match up the historical record with other maybe more material sources. So the types of sources that we have used, and some of which I used in the first half of my paper, are primarily administrative accounts of kind of governing bodies. So we have the bench books, which are the records of Hull's kind of town governors, the Commission of Sewers, who were appointed by the Crown to enact the Commission of Sewers Act in 1532. A lot of records to do with drainage in those series, but they also played a key role in flood risk management in early modern England. Now, the thing I would say about this table, if any of you have computer screens big enough to read it, it's not intended to be a record of every single flood event that Hull and the wider region experienced in this period, because we know that there will have been flood events that wouldn't have been recorded because flooding was a kind of regular event, and sort of lower magnitude, higher frequency events would not necessarily have been undesirable or recorded. So instead, this is a record of the floods that have come into the archives, and the reason they've come into the archives is because they were extraordinary in some way, so therefore they weren't kind of part of that regular pattern of flooding. So I pick out a few examples, and you can see here as well, sorry, there's different types of flooding that occur. So we've got a flood in 1349, which is a breach of the banks due to the impetuosity of the river. Some lovely descriptions of water for anyone here who enjoys words and literary stuff. So that would have been a breach kind of due to the Hull, probably. Although confusingly at this point, they also sometimes refer to the Humber as a river, so it's not necessarily clear which one it is. We have some more flood events in the 16th century, overtopping of the banks again. And so you'll see here that often when we get these extraordinary flood events that are recorded in the archives, it's because there's a failure of the flood infrastructure to protect the town. And then a final one I want to draw your attention to is during the Civil War, and some of you may know this already, but the banks of Hull were deliberately breached in order to flood the lands around Hull as a defence against a siege. So Hull was parliamentarian during the Civil Wars, quite famously started off the Civil Wars when they refused Charles' entry. And there were 2 royalist sieges, and during those times they deliberately flooded the lands around, which was incredibly effective as a defence technique, and Hull didn't fall to the royalists at any point, but it did have quite a significant impact on the agriculture around the town. This is a quote from a later historian. The roads were covered and the hay crop spoiled. The tillage lay too high for inundation, but all the grasslands would lie waste for some time after the water was drained away. So this kind of military, while sort of successful in military terms, it had probably quite a significant impact on the people of Hull, and more on that later. But what I want to say from this point, bringing your brains to the present, is we used some of these kind of flood histories, flood timeline, again in our community work when we're talking to people in Hull. And I want to draw your attention to this, which I have with me, but sadly I can't give it to you. If I was down in person, I would have brought a box with me. So one of the outputs of our project is It's a zine, which is kind of like a fun magazine. And this was produced by a local artist, Louis Dorton. But the contents of it are drawn from our community workshops, so creative writing workshops, textile workshops that I've already shared with you. But in the centerfold, and I couldn't really put it on the screen because it's far too big, we have this rather lovely flood timeline. So it's what you can see on the right of the screen, a little snippet of it. So we gave Louis the flood timeline that we had created from the documentary records, and he turned it into this really fabulous piece of art that at the kind of the backdrop of it is some of the weavings that were made in our community workshop. So it's a real kind of mixture of the historical research that we did as a team, the kind of creative outputs from members of our community, and then local artists kind of interpreting that. So if you click through on the link on the bottom of the screen, you can see an e-version of that zine. I was a bit, if I put that in there now, is no one going to listen to me for the rest of the talk because you'll be too busy reading the zine, but that's fine because it's a fabulous zine. And the other thing we have in the zine is some flood preparedness information as well. So you can see that here. It's a kind of mixture of kind of practical flood information as well as historical. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about a flood from the 1646. So this is not the same flood as the deliberate flooding of the banks of Hull during the Civil War. This is slightly later, so 1646. And I'll draw your attention back to this map that I've already shared. So Drypool is a small settlement on the edges of Hull. You can see it here through the map. For those of you who know Hull, this is the Deep. So that's the kind of region that we're in. So Drypool, as you can see here in the map, is in the 17th century really a small township. Is about 14 households in the hearth tax of 1672. Sorry, small hat tip to the Victoria County history for all these dates and facts and figures I'm giving to you here. And it was roughly 1,600 acres big. So despite being quite a small township, they are responsible financially for the upkeep of those banks that you can see there. And these banks were really important for protecting the Hull and the wider Holderness region from flood. But what we know is that by the kind of mid-17th century, so 1639, these banks were in decay. And the Commissioner of Seward, who are responsible for the kind of flood risk management, as we call it now, of the region, surveyed the banks and described them as being very ruinous and in great decay. And in order to try and repair these banks, they raised an extra tax to try and get more money from the people of Drypool to repair the banks. Now, somewhat not that surprisingly, having failed to collect a tax the first time when they laid a double tax, that also was unsuccessful. So what happened was that there was a flood, which was anticipated by the commissioners, but it did come to pass. So there happened such hideous and mighty winds, both day and night, that they forced up the waves and broke and carried clear away the most of the woodwork of the said banks, and wholly ruinated the same, a thing which came by the mighty power of God, which no power of man can withstand. So what we have here is most likely a storm surge. So it's probably a North Sea storm surge that we know affected other areas up and down the coast as well. So it wasn't just Hull, but it was a kind of extraordinary weather event that hit Hull. But in combination, so the kind of extraordinary event in combination with the poor state of the banks meant that the flooding was quite significant. Now, this is confusing because that site says October 1646, but it's a later document. This is describing a flood event from March 1646. So this is the Holderness level. This is Drypool, which is basically Hull. So we're not exactly sure how far the floodwaters went when the banks were breached after the storm surge. But according to the records at the time, it went kind of up, well, east as far as Marfleet, and Sutton and Stone Ferry to the north, and they were said to be subject to surrounding by the overflowing of Jaipur banks and Southcote banks. Apologies that my map work is not excellent here, but hopefully you get the idea. So we know that when the banks were breached in March 1646, there was a fairly significant flood event that kind of surrounded lots of the townships around of Hull. So we get that in March, and then by the summer of that year, the commissioners are still struggling to get the banks repaired, and they're kind of seem to be getting more and more desperate about trying to raise the taxes in order to repair the banks. So they do a survey in October where they find that these banks have diverse years past and still continue very ruinous. So as the damage sustained by the inlet of salt waters therein is not only of great loss to the inhabitants there, but spreading itself into the adjacent level grows very terrible to their neighbours by rendering the ways impassable, overflowing great quantities of ground and threatening irreparable ruin to the country if timely provision prevent not. So there's a sense of kind of urgency there from the commissioners that these banks need to be repaired, but also interestingly that acknowledge that if these banks are breached, then the whole level is likely to be affected. So even though it's only the citizens of Jaipur who are financially responsible for the banks, it's really a kind of wider area that's likely to be affected. So they level another tax in April and hope this time it works, but it doesn't. And one of the reasons is that the Jaipurers basically can't pay. So what then happens is there is another breach. So in the winter of 1646 into early 1647, there was another storm surge. And as a consequence of that, there is a much more catastrophic flood event. So we'll come back to the same map. So again, we've got Jaipur, and this time it goes as far north as Hempholme. 17 townships in total are kind of named in the records as being affected. So that's 14 miles as the crow flies north of Jaipur. And floodwaters are said to sit on the ground for at least 6 months. Lots of residents of local townships are forced to live in the upper rooms of their houses or move temporarily elsewhere. Now, moving upstairs in a flood event was maybe not that uncommon at the time, but the fact that it was this kind of long period of displacement was quite unusual. Roads were flooded and the waters were too deep to pass, even on a horse. And there's records that some people travel to market only by boat. And so as well as this kind of quite significant displacement of people, there was also longer term impacts on the land. So for example, this is salt water coming from the Humber, which is said to have washed away much of the fruitful soil, and the rest, this is a quote, so mudded and sanded with the ever flowing of the salt water, as it is rendered altogether useless, and so barren thereby, as if it be not lost, it cannot be recovered or reduced to the former goodness in many years. So there was a long-term impact as well on the soil and the kind of productivity of the soil. So I'm going to finish off this little case study of the flood because it hopefully leads quite nicely into the final bit about community, about responsibility for flooding. So the residents of Jaipur, as I said, are the ones responsible for the upkeep of these banks. And yet, when they fail, when they breach, it has a very significant geographical impact on the whole region. So you might be thinking, as the Jaipurers did, that maybe this isn't quite fair. So in 1646, they presented a petition to the commission pleading that they should not be solely responsible for the upkeep of these banks. And they draw on a lot of different reasons for that. They say that Drypool is but a screed of ground, so they're saying, it's only a small amount of space, and it joins upon the furious and unresistible arm of the sea called Humber, whose sea dike was assaulted by impetuous waves and surges, and was therefore in great danger to be quite washed and carried away. They don't dispute that they should have a responsibility to maintain these banks, but they basically say we've done our best, but the shore grows deeper and the tide swifter, and thus they need extra financial support in order to protect the level. So there is kind of hints there of maybe some kind of environmental change. I work in team with people that know about fluvial morphology and things like that, and this kind of historical reference, the shore going deeper and the tide swifter, is quite interesting because it suggests that possibly there's something that is changing about the morphology of the Humber. So there's kind of environmental challenges that the dry poolers recognise, but there's also kind of human challenges as well. So one particular human challenge that the dry poolers highlight is that during the Civil Wars, soldiers who were stationed in Hull, in a kind of garrison, by day and night broke and cut up a great part of the woodwork of the jetties and footbank for firing and other occasions, and in like manner took and carried away a great quantity of the timber and plank provided in store for the said repairs. So there is a claim here that during the Civil Wars, when timber was at a real premium, and there's lots of evidence for that in the garrison accounts, that the soldiers took wood from the banks. So what we know about early modern flood banks is it would likely have been a kind of earth bank at its base, so a big kind of pile of mud and earth, and then they would have been topped with timber. So the claim is that the soldiers interfered with the banks. And what I have also got on this slide is a rather lovely, imaginative, creative what this might have looked like. This is from our zine. So Louis Jurett, he was particularly taken by this story of the soldiers taking the wood. So he drew that. So there were a few other arguments that I won't go into now, but essentially the dry poolers claim that not only can they not pay for the banks on their own, that they also should not be responsible for it, because the banks are protecting a wider area and therefore the whole level should be taxed. There was a brief period of time when the commissioners kind of flirted with this idea of broadening the geographical area of responsibility for the flood defences. So they moved away from just taxing the dry poolers who lived adjacent to the flood defences, and then instead taxed the whole level, which was people that were kind of protected by the flood defences. So essentially broadening the boundaries of geographical responsibility for the defences. But this actually was deeply unpopular and very ineffective. The residents of Holderness refused to pay their taxes, and in fact the tax collectors who were sent out to collect the taxes ended up themselves being put in jail for not successfully collecting the taxes. So really there was a lot of refusal to pay their taxes, and none of it really worked. And the only way in the end that the commissioners managed to repair these banks was by paying for it themselves. But they still managed to get the money from the dry poolers because they paid for it themselves as a kind of loan from the residents of dry pool, and then kind of clawed that money back from the residents. So ultimately, it was the residents of dry pool who paid for the flood defence measures. So what we don't have here is a moment of environmental human catastrophe leading to change, which does sometimes happen in the kind of disaster literature. People who do research on history and disasters, sometimes you have a disaster and it changes the kind of processes of governance. In this case, nothing really changes, and the residents of dry pool remain responsible. So These histories, like I said to you, we shared this story about dry pool with our communities and with our artists as part of ways of provoking conversations about flood responsibility and flood stories. So let's just finish up the paper with some examples of how we did that and what was kind of produced as a result. So this is another map, and it's a rather beautiful map. So when we shared flood stories and flood histories with our communities, one of the things that really came out was that there were particular parts of the city that were maybe lacking in official flood narratives, flood stories, and East Hull in particular. Now, East Hull has a history of being kind of the more deprived part of Hull, and there was a maybe sense when we ran some workshops in the east of Hull that the flood stories of East Hull weren't really being told. And when we spoke to this artist, Layla, who when we kind of commissioned this piece, one of the things she wanted to do was rectify that by putting their stories on the map, as it were. So I have actually done another slide with this, a few examples of these that might make it easier for you to see. So what Layla did was take the stories that were written or kind of drawn by our community members and turn them into these really beautiful, they're kind of globes. They're meant to be like globes or bubbles. So some of them are real stories that people said, and some of them are kind of imaginative, creative stories thinking about you know, what flooding might be like in the future. And actually, if you go online and look at the zine, there is Layla's map is part of the zine, so you have a chance to kind of zoom in and see them a bit easier. But this is an example of how kind of people telling their flood stories became part of opening up conversations, and in particular a way of allowing communities that maybe felt like they weren't able to tell their stories to tell them. So another thing that we did, as well as kind of facilitate the sharing of stories, is also invite communities to think about how the past and the present interact as far as responsibility for flooding, kind of community action, I guess. So to not just say your stories matter, but also to say, you know, how do you want to shape your future as far as, you know, residents of Hull now. So what we did in one workshop is shared with them the petition that I've shared with you today, and talked through some of the arguments that the dry poolers made about their sense of flood responsibility. And then the participants at the workshop wrote their own petitions, which were kind of imaginary petitions, but in the process of writing them, we had conversations about responsibility and things that have happened to Hull in the past and what they think should happen in the future. So these are a few examples of them, and the one in the middle is actually one of the participants wanted to make a kind of sort of historical petition, so that's why she wrote this really fabulous one. And the reverse is she went around the room getting everyone to sign it, which was really great. So yeah, there's a few examples there of the petitions that our participants wrote in kind of direct response to the historical material, but also obviously informed by their own kind of experiences of flooding and kind of views about what should be done in the future. And the final activity brings me to the title of my slide, title of my talk, which is Watery Archives. So the final activity of one of the workshops we did, which was held at the History Centre in Hull, was to invite participants to create a watery archive. Now, the idea of this was to say to people, right, this is what is in the actual archive about Hull's flood histories. So I shared newspapers, manuscripts, maps. What do you think should be recorded and remembered about Hull's flood histories in the future? So what should be part of the story as we look to the future? Now, it was an imaginary archive, so there were no conservation concerns or limits in terms of how big things could be. So it was a kind of imagine what, you know, with no boundaries, what would you want to put into it? So there were lots of really fabulous things. I don't really have time to go into all of them, but just a few examples. Some people wanted to share their stories through objects. So this was dehumidifier, another dehumidifier, because lots of people's experiences of the recovery from the 2007 floods was dehumidifiers in their homes as they try and combat the impacts of the damp, and rising damp in particular was a big issue in the aftermath of the 2007 floods. So one of our participants wanted to put lots of dehumidifiers into our Watery archive. And then, as you might imagine, a kind of key theme of our Watery archive was around responsibility and accountability. So why was planning permission granted on floodplains? What could we have done better? What decisions were made in the past? And funding, what requested, what given, what needed. So there was a really strong theme in our submissions that participants felt that the archive, the Watery archive of the future, should record the decisions that were made in the past around flooding. And for me, this really echoed some of the historical material that I researched, where you can see that communities are really concerned with what decisions have been made around flood defences and how those kind of economic choices impact them. So I thought there was kind of really interesting echoes there of the Watery archive of the past. And it also demonstrates that this, while it was an imaginary Watery archive, was not just about collecting stories, but also a place for action. That in recording things like this, funding decisions, planning permission, for example, that it offers communities the opportunity to kind of empower themselves for actions in the future. Okay, so I would just finish up because I can see that we're on 6:30. So just two conclusions, really the main ones that I want to draw on. Firstly, I hope that I've demonstrated that water formed an integral part of the history of Hull in the past, as well as its story in the present. And living alongside this hazard and risk of water, as well as relying and using some of its benefits, shaped the story of the city and the wider region. Now, this is true for Hull, as it will be for other places, of course. And so I hope that I have demonstrated that the way in which people of the past managed and shaped their environment, as well as were shaped by it, must be a central part of all place-based histories. So really just to underline the importance of watery histories, environmental histories, for understanding people's relationship with their past, with their place in the past as well as the present. And then my second kind of main conclusion is that these histories can be compelling ways to open up conversations with local people about their own personal relationship with water and place, and can spur them into action and to make their own decisions around kind of personal climate action. So by considering how people of the past managed and negotiated their watery environment, communities today can be empowered to share their own knowledge and histories in order to shape their future for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was a really wonderful paper, and thank you so much for all those wonderful visual images that we've seen. A real treat for the eye, and I very much enjoyed all the maps, so no need to apologise for lots of maps. Great, so we've now got about half an hour for questions. So if anybody's got a question that they'd like to add in the chat, now's a good time to write it down, and I will kind of open the floor to people if you want to kind of raise your hand, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly. But while people are kind of thinking, one of the questions I had, Hannah, was I was really struck with your initial discussion about water management rather than just specifically about flooding and that kind of everyday relationship with water. And I just wondered what your kind of contemporary participants, what their reflection on water management was, in terms of their own kind of personal responsibility. How did they feel like what they should be doing in contrast to what they thought the council should be doing or other institutions should be doing? And then also, given the kind of nature of the discussion about bad water management that's currently within the press, was that something that was coming up a lot in conversations?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I would say that water management is a very recurring theme, and I would say I'd never do a community workshop without somebody asking about dredging. So please no one ask me about dredging, because I've really not got a very good answer. But yes, there, particularly in Hull, there is a sense that there have been decisions that have been taken that have negatively impacted the management of water in Hull. Now, 2007 in particular is a very kind of visceral example of that, of the, perhaps a failure of water, private management companies. There's a sense that, the changing of the Environment Agency's strategy around river management has had a negative impact on flooding, and a kind of nostalgia, perhaps, whether that's misplaced or not, about the way in which water used to be managed in the city. So yes, it's difficult, actually, because one of the kind of conversations you come back to a lot when you're talking about kind of doing kind of climate engagement is individual responsibility versus collective or external. So we do say to someone's put in the comments about dredging, yes, in fact, to the extent that I have had to try and get my physical geography colleagues to educate me about dredging so I can try and give a sensible answer to it when I inevitably get asked about it. So we do, so things like, for example, at the workshop we did in the History Centre, there were some people that put on evaluation forms, I will pledge to not astroturf my grass, or I'll get a water bar. So that there is a kind of individuals thinking about their own responsibility for water management, a bit like, the citizens of Hull in the 17th century, making sure they don't put pollutions in the water system. So there is a bit of that, and I think we have kind of actively encouraged those conversations as a project. We do work with the water companies and with the council. We work in partnership with Yorkshire Water, and we'll kind of try and encourage those individual actions, at the same time recognizing that this isn't all about personal responsibility, and nor ever should it be, which is partly why those activities, like with the petitions, is trying to kind of allow communities to have a voice for the frustrations that they have already, and rather than telling people what they should do or what they should care about, because frankly they don't need to be told. Actually, like, lots of people have got far more knowledge about Hull's especially contemporary flood histories than I do, so it's more about facilitating those conversations rather than by any means trying to sort of to educate about that. But yeah, I think it's a really big topic. And it's sometimes a bit tricky as an academic to try and not wade in too much about the politics of all that, but it is certainly something that people are knowledgeable about, and I enjoy listening to people when they share their kind of stories and experiences. So that was a very unwieldy answer.
Thank you. I've noticed that Justin's got his hand up, but Eris had asked this question in the chat before, but I wanted to make sure that I'd read it properly before asking it, because they say that they grew up in Hull and have lived experience of the 2007 floods.
Mm-hmm.
And ask a question about the recruitment of participants. Particularly, I'm curious about engagement around working class histories, especially in the bigger picture of class and climate change engagement. So yeah, how did you recruit participants, particularly that discussion around East Hull, and making sure that those stories were represented effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, firstly, I'll say that we were really affected by COVID as a project. So our story of everyone's lives, isn't it? So the kind of workshop timetable got really compressed, and so we ended up kind of recruiting and running workshops in a much shorter time period than we were expecting to, which did affect the recruitment. So there was a very strong emphasis on running workshops in communities rather than centrally. So I mentioned the History Centre workshop which was a kind of central workshop, but most of our workshops took place in community centres. So we ran one in East Hull, in the Freedom Centre just off Preston Road, and we tried to use kind of local networks, so like Facebook groups and other, libraries, things like that, to try and kind of push out. We worked with some pre-existing community groups, so like there was some over 50s groups. I sat through some bingo, which was fun. And we also worked with some youth groups as well. Child Dynamics was one. If you're from Hull, you might know. So we try to use existing community groups, networks. But I will acknowledge that there is always going to be a limitation there. So partly it was the fact that we're trying to get these workshops put together quite quickly. And also, inevitably, most of our attendees were people that were free in the day and could afford to come out in the day. And so is kind of, a limitation. Although we did run, right at the beginning of the project, Floodlights, which flashed up right at the beginning, was a kind of a multi-audio kind of creative event that was held in the city centre. And that had a lot of attendees, and that was maybe a bit more broad because that was an evening event. But in terms of our workshops, yes, and also in terms of kind of ethnic diversity as well, very limited. So there, the kind of, I guess, to very short answer to the question is, we did our best to push out and to advertise and to kind of meet people where they were at in terms of communities. But the people that came were sort of self-selecting, and that did have an impact on the people that came. But we weren't running this project like a kind of social science project. We need to sample and have, it was just, we wanted to kind of invite people in and go from there. So it is something we're trying to address in the future, and actually running some workshops in the summer with another project, hoping to maybe hit some new audiences in East Hull in particular. So yeah, if you're in East Hull, you can come.
Thank you. Justin, would you like to ask your question?
I can see there's a lot more questions in the chat, so I don't know if any of those follow on directly that you want to address first, or I can go ahead. Up to you.
You just go ahead, and we'll work through the questions in the chat.
Yeah. Actually, Hannah, in your first answer, you kind of started to explore this a bit, I think. I was curious whether you, in the kind of historicizing flooding and climate change related issues, whether you ever had unexpected, or you might even say undesirable, responses to that. I've certainly encountered people responding to conversations about the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period as, the climate's constantly changing, we don't need to do anything about it, type reaction. So did telling people about the history of flooding actually produce those kind of reactions in any participants as well?
That's an interesting question. Not that I know of, actually. No, I can't say, and I don't know whether that's just the nature of our participants, maybe. And maybe if we were, because I guess it was self-selecting, so people who came kind of knew what they were coming to, if you see what I mean. So maybe the sort of people that came would maybe be less like to raise those kind of issues. So no, not actually. Like I say, in terms of kind of combativeness about the material, it was more about issues of kind of water governance today. That was where we really kind of found the pushback from participants. But yeah, not really that, but it'd be interesting to maybe hear another time about how you handled that, because yeah, I can imagine that being challenging.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So in the chat, there was a question about the real kind of nitty-gritty practicalities of running the workshops, and a specific question about what happened to the artwork after it had kind of been exhibited.
Okay, so the artwork generally has gone back to the community groups. So where we worked with like a existing community group, and they kind of continue as a community group, the artwork has been returned to them. So I think most of the original pieces of art, so like textiles and stuff, have gone back to the people who made them. But what we did do was make quite a lot of effort to photograph everything, and actually produced a digital twin of Risky Cities. Now, I would have loved to share that with you tonight. I was messaging a colleague about it, but she said that the hosting's gone down, so I can't actually give you a link. But we had a sort of follow-on project with some other internal money. We worked with some VR special people who know about computers to turn the kind of Risky Cities exhibitions and artwork into a kind of digital, fully immersive VR thing. So that's sort of in the system somewhere that we might use at some point as a kind of digital legacy of the project. So yes, so I guess short answer is the people that made the art have eventually had it returned to them, but we hope to have some sort of digital legacy of the project going forwards. Yeah.
And could you say a little bit about building the relationship with the facilitators and the creatives who were involved in that?
Yeah, so we had money in the budget to pay and to commission artists, and that was, you know, really important part of the project that we did it properly. So we kind of put out like calls to local artists, and people pitched, and yeah, so that's how we did it. So for example, Louis, who did the zine, and we kind of continued to work with him as well. So he's a local artist illustrator. He ran the artistic workshops. He ran, fun fact, the front cover of the zine, Ruth knows this already, is a picture that I drew in a workshop. I did not realize I was going to end up on the front cover. Not very happy with Louis for that. But yeah, so he kind of ran the workshop and then produced the art. When we did the Flow of Words was a kind of sharings event where we had local artists interpret the submissions that were put forward by the community participants. So that's what Layla's map is, if you remember the one with the globes. So Layla came on kind of near the end of the project after the creative writing workshops. Again, the creative writing workshop was facilitated by a local playwright. So she ran them. So after the creative writing workshops, we kind of presented to these artists. We did a short kind of session where we shared the history, like a bit like what I've shared with you, and then we gave them access to all the material that was generated by participants, and then they created what they created. So we had the map, we also had some soundscapes as well, piece of classical music that was written. So at the sharings, which we held one on Hull campus and one at the Freedom Centre, which is East Hull again, those kind of artistic interpretations of those workshops was shared. And one of the things, I haven't got a picture of it, which is a shame because it would have been good, but one of the pieces of work was a door, and that's kind of important because doors are sort of thresholds between flooded houses and non-flooded houses. They were used for people to step on when the houses were flooded. So there were various things like that were kind of created by local artists. And as a consequence, we've developed a really nice network of local artists that are interested in particular in climate issues, and we continue to draw on them. So like I said, Risky Cities as a project is a funded project anyway, is finished, but we continue to do work and to use those artists to commission and to pay them to. So for example, we used the lady that did the creative writing workshops. She's done some for us in the future. We often, use them for our events. And the artists, the group of artists that we've kind of brought along with us, Risky Cities, are amazing, and they often come to our events. So they came to the event at the History Centre, and it's just really fabulous doing these kind of workshops when you've got a group of kind of engaged artists in a room, because they will not do your activities in the way that you've asked them to do it, but they'll often come up with something far better. So yeah, it's been a case, I guess, of just building up networks of local people and local artists, and letting them, giving them a brief, but then ultimately letting them do their thing with it.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting, that commitment to kind of local people as well. This is such a kind of placed project. Obviously, it has implications for thinking about living with water beyond Hull, and there are many places, Catherine's already said, thinking about coastal living in a totally different part of the country. But there are also specificities to the way in which Hull's life has developed with water, and so bringing local people, local participants, but also local creative people into that process, I think is really interesting. So Sarah has a few different questions, which are largely about the kind of impact of the project in terms of the ways in which contemporary communities have thought about climate. So do you feel that the project has effectively and sustainably educated people living in these areas about how to behave or to stay safe during a flood? Do you feel that people understand the risks of climate change and the necessity of climate action? And what's your impression on how people directly affected by the floods think about climate change and the way that they might respond to climate change? So is there an understanding of the links between climate change and then these kind of specific flood incidents in Hull on a more kind of local level?
Oh, really good questions, thank you. So we are kind of still working through the data, and we have some papers that are kind of in the works about specifically these questions. Most of the papers that have already been published out of the project are from the historical side of things. So slightly kind of watch this space on that, and it's not the bit of the project I was leading on. But I will say that the kind of evaluation evidence that we gathered was obviously evaluation forms from workshops, but also did some more in-depth interviews with some of our participants, and have some focus group evidence and things like that the people in the team are kind of working through, and in particular to really determine this question of like you said, Sarah, what impact does it actually have on people and their kind of the ways that they perceive climate change. And there is evidence from that data that we've gathered that what we've kind of called as a team develop a critical climate consciousness. So there's a sense from people that participated, particularly some of our participants came to lots of our events and kind of participated across the length of the project, that it did shape the way that individuals perceived climate, their kind of knowledge of climate change, and like you said, the kind of the risks and the necessity of action. So, you know, just small things like some participants that said, they put on their WhatsApp group, I heard this at the workshop, and, sharing information like that beyond just the people that attended. We always ask our participants at the end in the worksheet, are you going to take any action as a consequence of this? And there is sometimes small things like people put on, but of course there's a limit to firstly how we can really measure kind of the impact, and secondly on how much we can really judge kind of individual action as a consequence of attending our events. That's partly why there's this thinking about climate consciousness, that it's not just about what people do, it's also about the kind of the knowledge that they have about climate, how they share that with their communities, and how that kind of impacts on the future. And of course, there's more work to be done. This was not a kind of exhaustive project where we've solved Hull's issue with flood risk by any means, or as we spoke about earlier, I'd spoken to all the communities of Hull, and we've ticked that box. This was a kind of a way to start that work, I guess, and in particular, I think that one of the most enduring legacies of Risky Cities has been those partnerships and relationships that have formed. So like we're saying with Ruth, with local artists that we continue to work with. We continue to run workshops. We've got collaboration with Hull Maritime over the summer, and doing some more workshops with them, and kind of drawing on pre-existing relationships. We have members that will come to everything we do, that love a Risky Cities event, and whatever we put on will come, but then also to try and kind of extend beyond those existing networks to kind of reach different people. So I was talking to a colleague earlier today actually about community work, and it's really a long-term game. This isn't something that you can just sort of fix even over the course of a 2-3 year project. This is long-term. It's relationship building, it's showing commitment. And one of the things Jill Hughes was the kind of community engagement lead for the project, is really keen on, is demonstrating our ongoing commitment to these communities, and not just oh, we have this funded project, we'll do these workshops, and then that's it, we'll never talk to you again. That actually we've really tried to put certain things in place, like we've set up a network in Hull, it's called Water and Coast Network, that kind of brings together all the different people in Hull that are interested in water and kind of water related issues, because also recognition that there's lots of work happening in Hull, there's lots of charities, lots of individual practitioners that are interested in these sorts of things. So we've created this network that we kind of bring all those people together to try and think about how we can work alongside each other. So the university facilitates that network, but we don't lead it. The idea is to allow community members to lead it. So those legacies are enduring and will continue to build, I hope. But in terms of kind of like concrete, answers, or this many people now are, more likely to care about climate change, it's slightly harder to quantify. But I think we hope that it has been successful from that point of view, and will continue to build.
Thanks, Hannah. So kind of following on from that, Adam had a question about population mobility and people taking their kind of lived experience with them as they leave Hull. And I wondered, was there an element of this project that was about kind of gathering that social memory and kind of preserving it for future generations, as well as looking back to kind of those older historical documents?
Yeah, definitely. And I will say that Risky Cities it wasn't an oral history project. So we didn't do kind of proper oral history recording. And the stories and the memories that are preserved as a consequence of Risky Cities are preserved in the form of artworks. They're preserved in the form of the zine or the exhibitions or the textiles. But it is something that we're kind of thinking about as a team in the future. So these workshops that we're running in the summer with Hull Maritime are called Community Waterscapes. And the idea with them is to invite participants to share objects, stories, memories of water and flooding in the city, and we're going to kind of collect them and map them and create a digital map, hopefully, that will be a kind of legacy of that. So we are sort of exploring ways to actually record people's stories in a way that could be permanent or longer lasting, because people have got such amazing stories to tell. And like I said, Risky Cities wasn't an oral history project, but the historian in me wanted to write everything down that everyone was telling us, because they had often some really fabulous stories. So we're hoping to do a little bit of that in the future, like I say, with these workshops that we've got planned, and to do maybe a bit more of enabling people to kind of document their stories and histories.
But I love the idea that those things are recorded in a kind of creative way, rather than as a written statement or an oral.
That's it. It's not to lessen the value of that. And actually, if we'd have gone away and done 100 oral history interviews and put them on the university website, I don't think that would have been more valuable than what we ended up with. And it's the power of art and craft to enable people to participate. Lots of people arrive saying, "Oh, not everyone in Hull lived in Hull in 2007." So it was, "Oh, I don't have any memory," but actually the stories that people had, or the ideas that people wanted to share with us, were still really valuable, and creative methods were absolutely key for unlocking that. So it was a really effective and useful way of doing it, and it was a lot of fun as well.
Great. So that's all the questions in the chat. Is there anybody who has a kind of dying question that they really want to ask before we close today? No, I think, Hannah, Innes jumped in at the last minute.
Sorry. Took me a minute to find the raise hand button. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the artistic and creative aspects of the project as they relate to, I guess, artistic practice as a form of research and investigation, in addition to its role as a tool of public engagement and dissemination.
Okay, so as in the...
I suppose the question is, to what extent do the artistic and creative elements of the project help inform the research?
Okay.
So seeing them as something that's sort of central to the historical investigation, and not only as a sort of addition to the engagement elements.
That's a really good question. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure I've thought about it in that way before, but that doesn't mean that's not been part of what we've done. Because, you know, like I say, when we work, for example, when we work with Layla, who made the map with the globes, you know, part of the reason that she wanted to make that map was to address this perceived gap in the way that stories have been told about a particular part of the city. So, you know, the art that she made has itself kind of shaped the ongoing kind of research of the project. And like I say, we're doing these workshops in East Hull in the summer, and trying to kind of think about ways to address that gap. And I mean, seeing the historical, from a personal point of view, seeing the historical material interpreted by artists. So, for example, you know, Louis' illustration of the soldiers taking the timber has been a really kind of interesting process, because I think as a historian, I'm quite used to treating the archive as a kind of objective source of truth. So, you know, giving that to artists and seeing them and interpret it and realize it in their own way helps you then to kind of go back to the archive and maybe reimagine it, think about it from a kind of different perspective. And I found that really freeing and really, as a researcher, as a historian, as really, really useful. And in particular, I would say my kind of main takeaway of the kind of relationship between the history and the art is that these kind of place-based stories, and in particular the kind of physical putting of stories on a map, is a really kind of powerful way for people to engage with and understand their stories. And I think maybe helps you understand a bit more about the historical material as well, because it's you know, we talked to Communities Day about the importance of their place-based histories, while thinking about, you know, the historical communities of Hull and their relationship with place and how they perceived the places that they lived. So yeah, I'd say the project as a whole has really kind of blurred those boundaries between past and present, and it complicated it to a certain extent, but in a useful way. So I'm not sure if that really answers, and to be honest, I feel like I might be continuing to think about that for the rest of the evening, but so thank you for asking.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Anna.